I had never imagined there would be such a crowd today. I thought it was a small meeting. It's comforting to see all of you here today. At the beginning of my mandate, it was not really very often that I would speak to so many people at the same time. Things have changed quite rapidly. Maybe we can talk about that. I was asked to speak about my mandate and what I've been doing. And what I want to do is to introduce the main ideas that I've been trying to push in my mandate and introduce at the end my final report, which is on my website and will be presented to the Human Rights Council and is my contribution to the discussions about the Global Compact on Migration. And so that might kickstart a discussion. So protecting rights, facilitating mobility, and I would say facilitating mobility is the key word here, a principled response to migration challenges. First, I'd like to ask you a question. Who in this room lives today in the city of birth of your 4 grandparents? And there will be hands. There's 1 over there, 2. Think about it. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, I've counted you. Yep. So we have 7, maybe 8. Okay. This is something. And this is the proportion I get very often. Most of us here in this room have a migration story in our family within 2 generations. It may be a very small migration, like from Amsterdam to Brussels, yet it's international. It may be a huge migration in terms of kilometers from Montreal to Vancouver, but it's the same country, not the same language. It can be a small migration across international borders, or it can be intercontinental. But migration is part of who we are. We are a migrating animal species. And we've been for 200,000 years, and if we count our ancestors, probably for several millions of years. Migration is a normal response to stress. Economic stress, social stress, political stress. Actually, it's not the exception. Migration is the rule in our history. We've only been settled for a few thousand years. And that's not even most of us. So migration is what we do. Migration is what we've always done. And migration is what we'll continue to do. We're not going to stop migrating. And we migrate for all sorts of reasons. Studies, pilgrimage, holidays, work, internships, some of expats. We retire somewhere else. We do that. We don't usually consider ourselves migrants. We consider ourselves settled. But if we look through our life, our own life, we see that we were born somewhere, did studies somewhere else, worked somewhere else, changed job, retired somewhere else. We've changed many times in our lives. Not always a different country, but sometimes. And some people stay home, and some people stay close to home. We have a varied experience. So the idea here is that migration cannot be stopped. It can be diverted, channeled, organized, but migration is what we do. As long as we will not have an equal society, which gives equal chances and opportunities to everyone, people will leave places with less opportunities and go to places with more opportunities. And we do this, when I say we, I mean every one of us do this, very often out of duty or out of love. It's for ourselves, yes, but it's often mostly for family and for the children to provide them with a future. Very often, and especially if we migrate to jobs that are not really fun. We do it because others are depending on us. And so there is something about the moral high ground. Migrants give us a lesson, and we're not ready to hear it. More than that, I think that with because of technological change in the past 30 years, we have entered an era of more mobility. What was the most important possession of migrants in the summer of 2014, 2015, 2016? That was Google Maps. That was home. That was the smuggler. That was friends. And that was the most important thing. This was unthinkable 10 years ago. And so we have entered an age of mobility. Our repressive policies will divert, reduce, make pressure, will not stop the urge, the necessity, the will to migrate. And we have to understand that for migration, there are push and pull factors. The push factors are quite well known. We talk about the poverty, the violence at home. We have this distinction between refugees, and politicians are making that distinction between refugees and economic migrants. And you hear officials, even UN officials, say, oh, refugees need protection and they cannot be returned home, but economic migrants don't need protection, you can send them back. We all need protection for our human rights. In this room, we need protection for our human rights. We know that if we're not paid at the end of the week or at the end of the month, we can go to a tribunal. If we're called racist names in the street, we can lodge a complaint. If we're hit in the streets, we can go to the police. We know that. We don't think about those protections because we've gotten accustomed to them. But everyone needs protection of their human rights. And migrants are no different, and refugees are no different. And we fit in many legal frameworks in international law. The Refugee Convention, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Rights of Children, the Convention on Persons with Disabilities, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. All these apply to each of us, depending on who we are. And this should apply to everyone, and it's written in most of those conventions, everyone. Not citizens only, not migrants only, everyone. What we don't often recognize are pull factors. With globalizations in the past 30 years, we have delocalized quite a number of industries outside our borders in order to benefit from lower labor costs. Everything that could be delocalized was delocalized. But there are things that you can't delocalize. Agriculture, care, hospitality, fisheries, extraction, construction. You can't delocalize that. A house built in Brussels is a house built in Brussels. So what we've done in many cases is that we've delocalized labor conditions from the south to the north. And we have allowed, collectively, underground labor markets to flourish in all these sectors where migrant workers are exploited. So tomatoes grown southern Italy by people I've met in my mandate who are paid 20 euros for 10 hours of work picking tomatoes. None of us would do that job, except if we were placed in the same circumstances. But we wouldn't accept that as citizens of a country. But employers are ready to pay that in order to be able to sell their tomatoes. And the problem we have is that in many cases, no one has any interest in complaining against that system. Certainly the employer, the farmer, wants to produce good tomatoes at the lowest cost. The mayor of the village is happy that there are 15 farms in his village, or her village, that are actually prospering. The MP is happy that there are many prospering rural villages in the districts. The Minister of Economy or Finance is happy of the tax returns. And us consumers are happy to pay our tomatoes at a low cost. And migrants won't complain, because if they complain, they will be a troublemaker. They might be identified, detained, deported, and it's the end of the migration project, which is much more important to most of them than defending their rights. What they want is being able to support the family at home. So they don't say anything. Most migrants are absolutely silent about their condition. It's difficult to unionize agricultural migrants because they don't want to be associated with a union, because then they can be fired or they can be sent back home. So that those pull factors, we're not talking about them. We will need, at one point, to engage in a social conversation on how to make those sectors of the economy profitable without exploiting people, like we did for other sectors of the economy over the past century. And at the moment, we cannot have this conversation because no one is speaking up. And migrants are not stupid. Migrants come to countries where there are jobs for them, and they know it. Undocumented migrants all work. There's no social network for them, no social security mechanism. If they want to eat in the evening, they have to work during the day. And they know there are jobs. Not many people, not many migrants are going to Portugal, because Portugal has less jobs than most other European countries. Migrants know that. And we know it, and we're not saying much about it. Irregular migration is often presented as a criminal activity by politicians, by civil servants, by the media, especially that type of media. Yet it's not. It's not a crime. Entering the country with the wrong papers at the wrong place is the violation of an administrative rule, which says that you should present that type of paper and present yourself to a border guard. Yes, it's a violation of an administrative rule. It's not a crime. There's not a crime against persons, no one's hurt. It's not a crime against property, nothing's broken or stolen. It's not a crime against the security of the state. 99.9% of undocumented migrants are totally innocuous. There's no crime committed, yet we criminalize the language and the practices. We don't criminalize the law, mind you. Governments are very happy to use administrative law, and for those of you who have law studies, you will know the difference between criminal law and administrative law. The rules of evidence and procedure are much more stringent in criminal law. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. There are pieces of evidence that are not admissible. It's tough to be able to condemn. Administrative law is much simpler. It's not the same rules. It's much simpler rules. So we criminalize in language, in practice. We build migrant detention centers which look like maximum security prisons. So we've mimicked criminal law, but it's not criminal law. It's administrative law because it's much more convenient, quick, and there's less oversight. And this is a trend everywhere. In my country, in Canada, for example, the Canadian Immigration and Refugee Act is the only piece of legislation in the Canadian federal administrative law where all the appeals have been taken away. There's no appeal. There's control of legality or judicial control by permission and only on questions of law. Most immigration decisions are taken on issues of fact and in fact are not reviewable. So we've eliminated all appeals. And undocumented migration doesn't exist unless you have a barrier between the two countries. There was no undocumented migration between Italy and France during all the years of free movement of persons in Europe until last year, when suddenly in Ventimiglia, France stopped people from entering France, and smugglers created a new route, or it was an old route, rediscovered an old route through the mountain to get into France. We've created a new smuggling route. We are actually funding, supporting, entrenching smuggling rings. And we're not going to get out of this unless we think hard about why is it that we are doing this. We have lessons from the past. The Prohibition era prohibited the sale of alcohol in the US. You had big mafias, Al Capone, who were created because of that. An underground market was created because of the Prohibition. And you had Canadian families who made a lot of money bootlegging, especially in Montreal, the Seagram Empire. If you know the Seagram Tower in New York, the Seagram Empire was born of that. You cannot have a push factor and a pull factor and put a barrier between the two without creating an underground market. Same thing for the war on drugs. 40 years of the war on drugs. The cartels are as deadly as ever. Consumption hasn't gone down. So now we're thinking about harm reduction policies instead of zero tolerance policies, and that's the move that we're slowly doing. Legalizing, regulating, taxing activities that you cannot reduce, but you can take control of them. We took control of the sale of alcohol. We can take control of the sale of soft drugs. We can provide people who use hard drugs with safe places for injection. This is coming, and this takes away the market from the mafias and the cartels if we do that. That's called harm reduction, instead of trying to fight them on their own turf where they will win. And it's the same for the smuggling business. There was no smuggling business in the 50s and 60s across the Mediterranean. Everyone could take a ferry from Izmir or Algiers. No one died in the Mediterranean. So I think the objective for states would be to take over the mobility market rather than leave it to smugglers. Sorry. In terms of temporary migrant work, and now I'm talking about legal migration, people who come with a work permit, but a temporary work permit. We have allowed very precarious migration statuses to be created. We allow, for example, one of the elements is what is called the kafala system in the Gulf states, or the sponsorship system in states like Canada or Australia. The policies we create, the migration policies we create, have an effect on the employer-employee relationship. For example, sponsorship systems or kafala systems link the migration of one person to one employer, if you have a one-employer sponsorship system, which means that you come to work for that employer. If that employer fires you, you lose your work permit, your residence permit, you're sent back home. This employer wields a lot of power over your life and over the life of your whole family to whom you want to send back money. In doing this, we have just silenced most of the migrants who are exploited because they don't want to go back home. They want to send money home. And so they will accept whatever conditions the employer asks from them in order to be able to keep the support of the family with which they've been entrusted. And it's very important for them. So in Sri Lanka a few weeks ago, I was told about this woman who was hired in Sri Lanka to work for a family of 2 parents, 2 children. And when she arrived, she learned very quickly that she was going to take care of that family of 2 parents and 2 children, and of the family of the sister-in-law who had 6 children, and the brother-in-law who had 4 children. And she had to do that in the time that was provided in the contract, which meant that she worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, and came back home after 6 months sick. So the policies we create for migration create pockets of precariousness. We actually willfully, because we know that, and when I say we, I don't mean the whole of the population, but certainly policymakers do, we willfully create pockets of precariousness in order to silence people. And in many countries, certainly not here, but for example in the Gulf states, unionization is discouraged. So we need to change those policy frameworks. We need to start a social conversation on how to not exploit people. But again, migrants don't really complain. And the complaint mechanisms that would exist for us as workers are not really accessed by migrants for the reasons I've mentioned. One of the reasons why we can't seem to have progress on these issues, since what Mr. Le Pen was saying in the early 80s is still repeated today. He said, for example, 2 million immigrants, 2 million unemployed, which is a stupid equation in terms of economics. Absolutely ridiculous. There's no connection between the two. But it still resonates. It still resonates. Now, one of the reasons is that we live in electoral democracies in the global north, mostly. And electoral democracies are the best system we've ever invented to govern ourselves, so we cannot throw it away. But electoral democracies function because there is an electoral incentive for the politician to do this or that. And politicians are very quick, that's their business, very quick at catching the wind, seeing that there's this tendency and therefore I can win votes here and I'll do this. And this is important. It's not cynical saying that. This is the way we've organized our political life. And that's what, for example, women or Aboriginals in my country or gays and lesbians in the past 10, 15 years have learned to use. You use the political system. You make visible the political incentive to politicians, and you tell them, I'm going to vote against you if you don't do this. Politicians get it. Today, in many of our countries, not all of them, many of our countries, a sexist joke is a very dark spot on a politician's career. A homophobic joke, which was probably funny 20 years ago, is not funny anymore. We've learned, we've progressed. On migrants, we're at the same point now as we were 35 years ago in terms of the behavior of the politicians. There's no political incentive to do anything in favor of people who cannot punish you or reward you with their vote, because migrants don't vote. And they don't mobilize, they don't walk in the streets, except from time to time. It's quite rare, but it happens. But mostly, and we citizens don't start walking, marching in the streets for them. So there's no political incentive. And we know good politicians who cannot say really what they want to say on migration, because then their strategic advisor will say, if you say this, we're going to lose the elections. And then the strategic advisor tells them, and I can tell you what to say to win the election, but you won't say it, so shut up. And so very often, good politicians whom we know, and I know some in my country and in other countries, stay mum on the issue of migration. They don't engage much because they don't want to threaten their chances of winning the election, and they don't want to say stupid things about migration, and therefore they stay mum. And this is a structural limit of democracies. We could change that by giving long-term residents the right to vote. I don't think it's the right moment to push for that idea, but we'll have to think about it. It's a bit ridiculous that third-generation Argentinians of Italian origin can still vote for the Italian parliament when third-generation Turks living in Germany, for example, cannot vote for the German parliament. If you live under the law and respect the law and you pay taxes, you should be able to have a say in the political affairs. No taxation without representation is a very old saying of the American Revolution. So political discourses by politicians are irresponsible. Not that they are personally, morally irresponsible. That's not true. Most of them are not. But they're politically irresponsible. There's no punishment if there's not a reward for saying something stupid about migrants, like 2 million immigrants, 2 million unemployed, or many other things that we hear or read in the yellow press. Anti-immigration discourse tends to become normalized, although there's resistance, and this room proves it. The myths on which the nationalist populist discourse about migration is based go uncontradicted. We do not fight them, really. And it's difficult. For example, the language we use. We use about migrants in French and in English, the only two languages I know, but you can do the exercise for Dutch. We use a water language. Migrants flow. It's a migrant wave. It's a tide of migrants at our borders. It's a flood, a trickling through the border. They're streaming in, swelling, pouring, seeping, pooling, drowning, and we need to contain them. It's all about liquid. Why? Because a liquid is an indeterminate mass. There's no individualized drop of water. When migration is not about a mass, just like for any of us in this room, migration is always an individual journey. There are groups of people coming through, but for each of us, it's individual. And for the migrants as well. But we represent migrants as a depersonalized mass so that we can apply them what we would apply to water, a dam containing. Yet, migrants have rights. If we look at international human rights law and many of our constitutions and the European Convention, etc., migrants have rights, the same rights as we do, except two: the right to vote and be elected, the right to enter and stay in the country. All of the rights are for everyone. We're talking about fundamental rights. We're not talking about government entitlements. We're talking about fundamental rights. The same rights are for everyone. They are human rights, not citizens' rights. But with the political setup we have, the structural limit to democracy, very often we, in our minds, equate human rights with citizens' rights. I hear the phrase quite often, but if they want their rights, they could go home. You know, that's often the kind of answer I get when I talk about the rights of migrants. In those rights, there's the right to equality and the prohibition of discrimination. This means that any distinction between nationals and foreigners has to be justified. It's not impossible to make a distinction. Only foreigners can be expelled. Citizens cannot be expelled from the country. That's a recognized distinction, which is perfectly acceptable and is not a discrimination. Now, the conditions on which someone can be expelled, we have to discuss about what those conditions should be. So distinction can be made, but they have to be justified, like for any other distinction. Distinction about age, skin color, religion, etc. And the labor standards should be the same. A worker is a worker is a worker. Whether the worker is undocumented or with a very short-term contract, labor conditions provided for in the labor code should apply. Employers should be punished if they don't respect the labor code. As long as you work, you're a worker. Your status doesn't matter. You still work. And in that sense, all this is a conception of dignity. It is part of our dignity in this room that our rights be protected. It should not be different for migrants. Yet the human rights speech on migrants has little traction. And here I was helped by a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. And he's a social psychologist, and I know nothing about social psychology, so if there are social psychologists in the room, please forgive my ignorance. I'm trying to repeat and apply what Jonathan Haidt has said to the immigration role. What he said is that we make our moral decisions on 6 criteria. Don't ask me why. 6 criteria: freedom, fairness, care, authority, loyalty, sanctity. I don't know where that comes from. But this is the 6 moral criteria. You see them on the list here. He divides people on a spectrum between liberals and conservatives. And he says that liberals make their moral decisions on the first 3 criteria: freedom, fairness, and care, while conservatives make their decisions on all 6 criteria. And typically, the human rights discourse is a liberal discourse. The human rights discourse is about freedom, fairness, and care, not about loyalty, authority, or sanctity. And so we liberals, and in his category, I certainly am a liberal, we liberals, we're simply not addressing what the conservatives among us think important. And that explains why, when I explain the human rights of migrants to people, I get typically the answer, not typically, but sometimes I get the answer, very interesting, I know you're right, but I disagree. Which is quite extraordinary in terms of logic. But that's exactly what people feel. So that answer is very important. I cannot dismiss it. I can smile for 2 seconds, and then I get very serious because I don't know what to do, frankly, to go beyond that. So I've given it a bit of thought still. So this has not happened, or this has happened differently for women, for gays and lesbians, for detainees, for Aboriginals in my countries, for persons with disabilities, because they've been able to speak up their own mind. They've been able to speak up in their family, in their village, in their workplace, and in the public sphere as politicians or as electors. And that's what migrants are not doing, really. And so the human rights speech is somewhat ineffective to convince people, because migrants are not there defending their own rights. In our countries, rights have never been given by anyone to anyone else. They've been wrestled by some people from those who had the power. Women wrestled their rights from men's, from the men's over for the past 60 years, and with some difficulty. And we're still on that road. We're not finished. And it's the same for many other categories of people, but for that, you have to be politically active. Migrants often are not. And so we need to have the migrants' voice heard. And since they won't speak politically, we need to find other ways. And that's what I call the empowerment of migrants, like we've talked about the empowerment of women for a long time. So where are the places where migrants can speak up? Certainly independent institutions such as courts, tribunal, national human rights institutions, ombudspersons. These places are places where if you complain, you can get a result, because judges are usually not interested in the political debate. They're usually interested in the coherence of the law. So they will ask for the justification about the distinction that I was talking about. National human rights institutions have started very recently to make reports about discrimination against migrants. In my country, the first big report was 2011 by a national human rights institution. Civil society is very active. You're here. Churches, unions, getting into gear. Churches have been good for a long time for refugees. International organizations are there. Public services is yet a source of helping migrants find a voice, which is yet untapped or insufficiently tapped. One of the ideas that has emerged in the past few years is the idea of firewall. The firewall is the idea that immigration enforcement services cannot use other public services as auxiliary. Because we've seen that in many of our countries, that suddenly there was in a hospital, there was a directive from the director of the hospital to all medical personnel, please tell us when you meet an undocumented migrant. And the reaction has been the same almost everywhere. No way, because if I do that, I won't see them, period. They won't come to the hospital. I'm here to care for people, not to denounce them. And it was the same for schools. In my country, in Toronto, schools are prohibited from asking for immigration papers. In Quebec, they are asking for immigration papers, otherwise you can't register your child. In fact, directors are not doing it, but the law is there. This is a firewall that they've established in Toronto. In many cities in the US, the police department, the municipal police department, has requested the municipality to prohibit them from asking migration papers, so that they can officially go everywhere in the city and say, you can call us if there are gunshots next door, if there's family violence, because we won't ask for your papers. We couldn't care less. You're part of the city, that's all we want to know. And we're going to work with you, and we're going to serve and protect you as anyone else. In New York, there's this, Bill de Blasio instituted this New York ID card, which gives services to everyone without distinction of status. These are all firewalls. The idea that immigration enforcement cannot use other public services. It's been supported now by a resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, so there's an official document which is interesting. And we should look at cities. Cities usually have had, in the past 10, 15 years, very good policies regarding migrants because they're interested in social integration. Social integration of all categories of people who could be marginalized. And it could be based on age, social status, immigration status, poverty, or whatever. And cities are interested in integrating these people. And we've seen quite a lot of good practices coming from cities. There is now, as we speak, a push for global migration governance following the Mare Nostrum summer and the German summer. Migration governance has become a global issue and has reached the UN. For the longest time, states did not want that the UN touch the migration issue because that was territorial sovereignty. It was out of bound for the UN. And they've realized that they cannot do it alone, not even bilaterally, and sometimes, as we've seen in Europe in the past 2-3 years, not even regionally. So states have started reaching to the multilateral level, which they had avoided as much as they could for the longest time. And now, at the UN, there is a movement towards establishing a framework for global migration governance. I'll skip that. I can come back in questions. This is very new. There has been cooperation on migration at regional level through very discrete regional consultative processes for over 30 years, and sometimes more recently than that. There has been bilateral cooperation, like between Canada and the US on one border. And there has been other fora where it was discussed, and regional organizations like the EU have established internal freedom of movement. So you have elements of migration control here and there, but never at multilateral level, never generally for the world as a framework for how we treat migrants and how we organize migration. This is new. This has come out of the European crisis and the Andaman crisis and the crisis with the people from Central America going to the US. It has taken that the global North states were affected to become a global issue. It has been a problem and an issue for Southern states for much longer than that, but now that it's affecting the North, it's a global issue. Thank God we can start discussing it. And so what has happened in the past year is that the UN has been called by states to integrate migration into their agenda. We have had a New York summit in September 2016, where a New York Declaration was adopted with lots of references to the human rights of migrants. States speak the human rights language now. Walking the walk will be more difficult, but they at least speak the language, so it's a good thing. IOM, the International Organization for Migration, has been included in the UN family in September. It was created at the same time as UNHCR in 1950. It was included in the UN only last year, not even last year, 6 months ago. And states have committed to negotiating within 2 years a global compact on refugee and a global compact on migration. Global compact on refugees is probably hopes are quite low, and so it's going to be the 1951 convention with a small plus. Probably, who knows, but probably. For the global compact on migration, there's no template. Anything can be done. That's interesting and scaring at the same time, because it could, end up being very little, but it could be something a bit more substantial. This is my idea, my country, and we don't know anything about what's going to come up in this negotiation. The co-facilitators are Mexico and Switzerland. The new special representative of the Secretary General is Louise Arbour, the former High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN. So we have as Secretary General the former High Commissioner for Refugees, and as Special Representative on International Migration, a former High Commissioner for Human Rights. I mean, these stars are aligned. Good thing. But no one knows what the global compact on migration will look like. Will it be formal, informal? Will it be mandatory? Will it be a treaties? No, probably not. A treaty? No. We don't know. We have no idea. A declaration, a plan of action, no one knows. At this point, no one knows. And no one knows the content either. We don't know what states will agree on. My idea is that we have to implement Section 10.7 of the SDGs, which says that states have committed to facilitating regular, safe, and orderly migration and mobility. Facilitate means making easier. So the objective, the long-term objective, is facilitating, organizing mobility so that it's not a problem, making it easier for everyone to move around. That's the objective. And one of the issues we have with migration policies is that the timeline is always now. We need to stop the migrants now. We need Indian ITs now. It's never 10 years, 20 years from now. We never do strategic planning about migration policies, except a little bit countries like Canada and Australia, which want to build up their population. But apart from that, there's no strategic planning. So my idea, and I'm called to conclude, is to create an agenda, just like we did the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, 15-year agenda with goals, targets, and indicators. In my last report, I propose an Agenda 2035 for facilitating human mobility. And it has goals, targets, and indicators. 8 goals, like the MDGs, 57 targets, 56 indicators. I have no illusion that this will be picked up by the states and end up in the Global Compact. My idea was to suggest to states that they should look beyond the nationalist, populist bump that we're hitting now, because there will be an after Trump. And we have to think about that. And at that time, we need to have a plan. And the idea is to facilitate. So I give you here the 8 goals that I have that we should, at one point, reach or aim for. Offering regular, safe, accessible, affordable mobility solutions, protect labor rights, respect human rights and border control, end detention as a border management and deterrence tool, provide effective access to justice, ensure easy access to basic services, protect all migrants from discrimination and xenophobia, and increase disaggregated data. There are very few people who can be against those goals. These goals would create a lot more peaceful, serene migration policies, and we would be able to divert the humongous amount of money that is spent on deterrence and border controls to other things. And I conclude with that, I'm quite hopeful because there are lots of silver linings. There are reasons to be hopeful, despite the fact that we have all these nationalist, populist discourses around. Artists, for the past 10, 15 years, have provided us with novels and films about migration, about identity, about who are we, the multiple identities that we carry. And we can see that in so many films and TV series. The business community is all in favor of mobility and diversity. That's how they thrive. That's how they have creativity in their boardrooms as well as on the work floor. The media, yes, you have the Yellow Press and the Daily Mail, but you have the New York Times, who now has an immigration correspondent. That didn't exist 5 years ago. And we have very good journalism being made in Idomeni, in Lampedusa, in Andaman Sea. We've read in the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years excellent stories. And the media, and especially social media, which can be horrible, can also be excellent. And we have a much more sophisticated discussion about migration in the good media than we had 5 years ago. Civil society, international NGOs are working hard on migration issues. Unions are getting round. They don't see migrants as competition anymore, not only. Courts, tribunals, I mentioned. Technology changes, the telephone I mentioned. The youth, those who are in the 20-somethings of today, for them, mobility and diversity is in their way of life. They have many friends coming from many different parts of the world, and they've moved around thanks to Erasmus and other. When they come, and that's very different from my generation. in Montreal in the late 60s, early 70s, going to Toronto was a big thing. Mobility and diversity was not my thing at all. Kids today, especially in urban centers, are used to that. When they come to power 20 years from now, they will bring that to the exercise of power. And that to me is very reassuring. I'd like to see things moving before that, though. So that's my problem. But migrants themselves are examples of courage, grit, determination, resilience. Their stories, which are not yet well told, but are known in their own families, their stories are illuminating. Their stories are inspiring. And when that comes out, and it comes out in the literature and in film and in arts, it is part of what will inspire us generally. And so there is already, I think, a change in the narrative over the past 5, 6, 7 years. We've seen a change. It's still difficult, but it's more sophisticated than it was. And the migrant is not either the poor victim or the criminal that was the caricature of a few years back. It's a much more sophisticated way. They are in part and more recognized as agents of their own future, the future of their children, but also agents of our future, changing our societies in small ways and changing our views on them and on diversity and mobility generally. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.